"How the heck can you still be cold?" I asked, pulling off my jacket and draping it over her shoulders. She shivered, huddling deeper into her coat. "I'm anemic. Are you insane? It's like 4 degrees out here." I stretched my arms, feeling the brisk autumn air cut through the park. The city lights were dimmed here, muffled by the dense trees, and while trash littered the ground, we both learned to ignore it. I liked this park. It was a quiet corner in an otherwise noisy city. She rolled her eyes, her ears twitching, a little quirk I found oddly endearing. Bundled up as she was, she looked almost feline, the way she always lounged in the sunlight or cozied up by the radiator. In the summer, though, she became a different person, always insisting we visit the beach, flaunting her toned physique in a way that made me hit the gym a little harder just to keep up. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me as we strolled through the quiet park. Her ears twitched again as she chuckled softly, and I glanced down at her. "What's so funny?" I asked, intrigued by her sudden amusement. "Nothing," she murmured, but the mischievous look in her eyes said otherwise. Later back at home, I found her in the kitchen, her hands submerged in a bowl of what looked like chicken soup. "New beauty treatment," I teased. She flashed a grin, pulling out a piece of chicken and popping it into her mouth. I sat down beside her. "You know, it's hard to improve on perfection." She rolled her eyes, her ears twitching wildly, a sign she found my compliment cheesy. I leaned in, playful. "Did it work?" She smiled. Maybe cooking wasn't her strong suit, but she tried. She had an odd palate, favoring meats with a bizarre combination of hot sauces and spices, things that shouldn't belong together. Tonight, it was steak with green hot sauce and cinnamon. I winced inwardly but didn't have the heart to tell her she couldn't cook. I heard her curse under her breath from the kitchen, and my stomach clenched. It was always a gamble when she tried to make dinner, and tonight, I suspected, would be no different. "You okay?" I called, rising from my seat to check on her. "I just cut myself." "I'm fine," she insisted, cradling her hand, the knife glistening with a few drops of blood next to a strange splatter of green hot sauce. Odd. I thought we'd run out of that vile stuff. "You sure?" I asked, stepping closer. She waved me off, muttering, "I'm fine." "Go sit down." I hesitated, glancing at the steak she was preparing, and wondered what unspeakable horror she was doing to it with the hot sauce. Backing out of the kitchen, I sighed, knowing that the meal was doomed, but loving her too much to care. Later, as we climbed into bed, I found myself mesmerized by the way the moonlight seemed to sink into her skin rather than reflect off it. It was an odd effect, but by now, nothing about her really surprised me. Leaning closer, I noticed something unusual. There was a small horn-like spike on the back of her neck, and it was oozing a strange green mist that evaporated before touching the sheets. I sighed, rolling onto my side. She really needed to tell me where she was from. Alpha Centauri? Andromeda? The Large Magellanic Cloud? I didn't know, but I was too tired to care. As sleep took me, a fleeting thought crossed my mind. Was she going to eat me? I chuckled to myself. Honestly, at this point, I wouldn't even mind. I was whipped, and I knew it. The next morning, I found her at her computer again, her skin absorbing the faint glow from the screen. She'd been doing this a lot lately, especially since she installed a small antenna array in the attic. I didn't ask questions, but I knew that thing wasn't part of our standard rental agreement. "You coming to bed?" I asked, watching her type furiously. "In a minute." "I've got to figure this out." I couldn't help but joke, contacting the home world. Her ears twitched, and she let out a stuttering laugh. "Something like that." I sat down beside her. "You know you can trust me, right? You've got me pretty well wrapped around your finger." She blinked, her expression faltering for a second. "What are you talking about?" I smiled knowingly. "Pheromones. I figured it out months ago. You're not just cold-blooded, you're an alien." She froze, her ears twitching nervously, before slowly standing. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice trembling. "About 6 months," I replied calmly. "Your blood, it's not human. It's green. Your skin absorbs light, probably an evolutionary advantage. And then there's the pheromone. It's been making me a little addicted to you. So I synthesized a suppressant. I've been using it on myself." She stared at me, wide-eyed. "You knew." All this time I nodded, stepping closer. "I did. And I'm not mad, if that's what you're worried about. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Her shoulders sagged in relief, and she took my hand. I'm on the run, she confessed. I'm one of the last of my kind. The enemy is still looking for me. I squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to hide here. Not from me. Just be yourself. That night, I watched as she revealed her true form. Her ears, usually twitching in human-like expression, extended slightly. Her teeth sharpened, more suited for a carnivorous diet. Her skin seemed to absorb the dim light of the room, blurring her edges, making her blend with the darkness. But her face, the familiar curve of her brow, the soft expression in her large, now slightly more predatory eyes remained the same. Do I look okay? She asked, her voice carrying a slight, otherworldly reverberation. I leaned forward, placing a kiss on her lips. You look beautiful, I whispered. She smiled, the tension in her body relaxing as she accepted my words. The next morning, I served her breakfast: bacon, pancakes, and a side of corned beef. Her ears flattened against her head as she yawned, exposing her sharp teeth. I suppressed a primal urge to flinch. Those teeth were a predator's, but I had grown accustomed to them. Bacon and eggs looked perfect, she said with a smile, digging in. I, on the other hand, opted for a simple apple, much to her disgust. You and your plants, she muttered, rolling her eyes. Seriously, do you know what kind of nasty stuff grows in the ground? I laughed, taking an exaggerated bite of my apple. She glared at me, her ears twitching in annoyance, but I knew she didn't mean it. For all her oddities, I loved her, and that was enough. Later that evening, as we sat together on the couch, a blanket draped over both of us, we lazily scrolled through our Netflix queue. I turned down the heat in the house, just enough to make her snuggle a little closer. She let out a small chirp of laughter as we watched an old sci-fi show. Does he really have to sleep with every alien? She asked, pointing at the screen where the lead character was once again romantically involved with another extraterrestrial. I grinned. What's wrong with banging aliens? I teased, pulling her closer. Her ears twitched again, hair starting to grow on them now that she wasn't shaving them anymore. I'd grown used to it. Nothing, she said, laughing. But seriously, is that all humans would do if they met aliens? I shifted to look her in the eyes, amused. And our first date was different. How her face blurred slightly, her version of blushing, a camouflage instinct kicking in. That was different, she hissed softly. We were at the restaurant for 5 minutes before you dragged me back to the hotel room. I chuckled, recalling the speed at which our relationship had escalated. Well, maybe the pheromones were working overtime. I didn't even stop to think that you might be planning to eat me. She gave me a playful slap under the blanket. I was in heat, she muttered, clearly flustered. I blinked. Wait, you're cold-blooded, but you go into heat? That's a unique combo, she laughed, leaning into me again. Not exactly cold-blooded, and in heat is the closest human approximation. Let's call it a rough translation. I nodded, pondering that as we settled back into the couch to continue watching. But, as always, I couldn't resist pushing the envelope. So, when's the next time you'll go into heat? I asked, half joking, half serious. She smirked, her ears twitching. I'm not telling you that. You'll just have to stay on your toes, I smiled, accepting her answer as we cuddled up again. Moments like this felt surreal, knowing I was dating someone who wasn't from this planet, yet feeling more connected to her than anyone I had ever known. As the show played on, I couldn't help but think about what the future held for us. There were still so many things I didn't know, but the one thing I was sure of was that I didn't care where she came from. I just wanted to be with her, wherever that might lead. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of something burning. My stomach churned at the thought of her in the kitchen again, experimenting with new recipes. I reluctantly got out of bed and found her at the stove, the same determined look on her face as she flipped something that resembled charred remains. What are you making? I asked wearily. She glanced over her shoulder. A mischievous grin spreading across her face. You said I should learn what you like, right? I'm making mashed potatoes. My heart sank. I had no idea how she would manage to mess up something as simple as potatoes, but I had no doubt she would. Great, I forced a smile, mentally preparing myself for whatever strange concoction awaited me. Sitting down at the table, I watched her serve up the potatoes. They were lumpy and oddly green, probably a side effect of whatever seasoning she had used. "Go ahead, try it," she said, her ears twitching with anticipation. I took a small, cautious bite, the flavor hitting me like a train. It was a bizarre mix of spicy, tangy, and something else I couldn't quite place, probably the hot sauce again. "Interesting," I said, struggling to keep my expression neutral. She grinned proudly, clearly pleased with herself. "I knew you'd like it," I nodded, forcing down another bite. It wasn't the worst thing I'd ever eaten, but it was far from the best. Still, I appreciated the effort. Later that evening, as we sat together once again, the moonlight filtering into the living room, I found myself thinking about how much my life had changed since I met her. Sure, she was an alien literally, but that no longer seemed to matter. The quirks, the odd habits, the way she tried so hard to fit into my world while I tried to understand hers, it all just worked. We might have come from two different worlds, but here, in this tiny space we'd carved out for ourselves, we were just two people in love. As I lay there, surrounded by the cocoon of blankets, I realized just how much this strange, wonderful life with Rogue meant to me. Sure, it was unusual, but it was ours. But as peaceful as it was, I really hadn't thought this through. I still needed to use the bathroom. She looked over at me, her eyes reflecting the dim light, and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. I leaned over, planting a kiss on her forehead. "Just about how lucky I am," I said, and it was true. Despite all the weirdness, all the questions still unanswered, I wouldn't trade this for anything. Not even for a planet without green hot sauce. She chuckled, snuggling closer. "You're not bad for a human, you know." I grinned. "And you're not bad for an alien." We sat there in comfortable silence, the universe outside our little bubble seeming both vast and insignificant. Whatever came next, whether it was her homeworld calling or some intergalactic chase, I knew we'd face it together. And that was all that mattered. "That tickles." Rogue giggled as her ears twitched uncontrollably. "I'm not going to get to see them at all tonight, am I?" I teased, carefully tucking her ears under her hair and securing them with bits of tape. It was an uncomfortable process, but necessary when her ears tended to move of their own accord. Her sharp teeth were concealed as well, and if I didn't know any better, I'd swear she looked completely human. "I still don't get why we're doing this," I muttered. "Both invited me on a double date with her boyfriend." "It's important," Rogue said, her voice slightly strained. I glanced at my phone. "We still have time before the reservation." Rogue shoved me toward the closet. "Not for you." "You need to get dressed up," I groaned as she rummaged through the mess in my closet, eventually handing me a black button-up shirt and dark jeans. "You want me to look mysterious?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged. "I like black." "It's not something we wore much on my planet." Her mention of her planet caught me off guard. She didn't talk about it often, and whenever she did, I sensed there were things she wasn't ready to share. Slipping into the clothes, I gave her a wink. She reached up, messing with my hair, giving it a windswept look. "Ready?" I asked, resisting the urge to flatten it back out. By the time we got to the restaurant, I was about ready to stab the steak knife into my own hand just to escape. Rogue wasn't faring much better. Her taped-down ears twitched beneath her hair, a telltale sign of her growing discomfort. Kent, Beth's boyfriend, hadn't stopped talking since we sat down. He was one of those self-important types, endlessly bragging about his job as a manager and how he had to fix everything because everyone else was incompetent. I glanced at Rogue, who looked like she was calculating the odds of surviving a sudden escape out the back door. So I had to redo all the accountant's work. Kent droned on, his mouth half full of appetizers. "Guy doesn't even know how to use accounting software." I sighed in relief as the waitress arrived with our food, hoping to avoid further conversation. As she set down the dishes, Kent chuckled obnoxiously. "Come on, I'm starving over here." I blinked, unsure how to respond to his attempts at humor. Rogue, however, stayed calm, even as the waitress hesitated to place her order of 3 large rare steaks. I realized with a jolt that to anyone else, Rogue's meal choice would seem strange for a woman her size. But she needed the extra protein. Her metabolism was uniquely inefficient, burning through energy faster than any human could imagine. The waitress gave her a confused look but set the plates down without comment. "A group steak dinner?" the waitress asked, clearly unsure if it was meant for more than one person. Rogue merely grinned and started cutting into her first steak, purring contentedly. I couldn't help but smirk as she made short work of the meat. Kent shot me an odd glance, probably judging my chicken Caesar salad, but I didn't care. I had been craving vegetables lately. As the meal dragged on, Kent continued to monopolize the conversation. "So what is it that you do?" Kent asked, barely looking up from his overcooked steak. He waved his knife around carelessly, nearly flicking steak juice onto my shirt. "I'm a biochemist," I answered, keeping it short. "I work in a lab, mostly retesting experiments from other labs to verify them before they get published." Kent perked up. "Biochemist, huh? So when are you going to cure cancer or something? I mean, you're testing drugs, right? Isn't that what scientists do?" He waved his knife again, narrowly missing my sleeve this time. I forced a smile. "Not exactly curing cancer," I said, trying to avoid a deep dive into my actual work. I wasn't in the mood to explain the intricacies of drug trials to someone who probably wouldn't care either way. Rogue glanced at me, clearly picking up on my growing frustration. As Kent rambled on about his managerial duties, Rogue quietly finished her steaks in record time and, without hesitation, began picking at the chicken from my salad. Her metabolism worked fast and her appetite was endless. "We need an escape plan," I whispered to her, leaning in. Rogue's ears twitched, still held down by the tape, and she nodded subtly. "Any ideas?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Before I could respond, the waitress, who had been struggling with a tray of dishes, tripped, sending an avalanche of dirty plates directly into my lap. Bones from a pile of T-bone steaks tumbled into my lap, along with a mess of half-eaten food. Rogue, who had been sitting beside me just a second ago, suddenly appeared on the other side of the table, sitting next to Beth. I blinked, trying to figure out how she had moved so quickly. "I'm so sorry," the waitress stammered, bending down to retrieve the plates from my lap, her face flushed with embarrassment. Kent, who had only a small stain on his shirt, stood up dramatically. "What the hell are you doing? This shirt is ruined," he yelled, brushing the tiny splatter on his sleeve. I looked around the restaurant, catching the disapproving glances of other diners. If anyone had the right to be upset, it was me, with a full plate of bones in my lap. But I wasn't about to make a scene. "It's fine," I said, waving my hand, trying to calm the situation. Kent, however, wasn't letting it go. "I'm not paying for this," he barked, grabbing Beth by the hand and storming out of the restaurant. The place fell silent as everyone watched them leave, the waitress standing there mortified. "Well, that was one way to end it," I muttered, glancing at Rogue. She nodded in agreement, a mischievous grin on her face. "I'll make sure you don't have to pay," the waitress said, her voice small and shaky. I pulled out my wallet and handed her my credit card. "Don't worry about it," I said. "Just bring me a towel and we'll call it even." As she scurried off, another waiter rushed over with a towel. The manager soon followed, apologizing profusely and offering to comp the meal. I declined, insisting I pay on the condition that next time they make the steaks a little bloodier for my girlfriend. Rogue smirked at that, clearly satisfied. Once we were back in the car, Rogue reached up and yanked the tape off her ears with a sigh of relief. They twitched violently as if they had been holding back their natural movements for far too long. "What's up?" I asked, noticing her unusual silence as she stared out the window. "You're different," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "Thank you. My mother always told me I was a special flower," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. She huffed, shaking her head. "No, I mean it. Most men of my world would have acted like Kent back there. Worse, actually. If something like that had happened, they'd have been furious, maybe violent." I frowned, thinking about her words. "Would you want me to act like that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "No," she replied quickly, her ears twitching again. I could smell the waitress's stress. She made a mistake. "You didn't freak out. You're calm. I'm dating an alien," I said with a shrug. "I guess freaking out over spilled food doesn't seem like that big a deal in comparison. Besides, life's too short to let stuff like that bother you." I glanced at her. "Plus, it ended a disaster of a double date, so I'm kind of grateful." Rogue chuckled. "Yeah, sorry about that. I guess Beth sees her boyfriend through lavender-tinted glasses, rose-tinted," I corrected with a smirk. But that's how most relationships work. You don't think I'm the best in the world?" I asked playfully, nudging her. "Maybe," she said with a smile, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "But right now you smell too much like dinner. I might just take a bite out of you." She clicked her teeth together, her jaw relaxing into a predatory grin. I laughed nervously, mentally checking off any romance that involved food from my list of possibilities. Those teeth and the look in her eyes were a little too serious for comfort. It had been a long day, and by the time I left work, the sky had already turned dark. There had been a chemical spill and some misfiled paperwork to deal with, meaning most of my hours had been wasted putting out fires. On top of that, Rogue had the afternoon off, so I should have been able to spend time with her, but now it felt like I'd missed out. Stepping into the house, I immediately noticed how warm it was. Rogue had clearly turned up the heat again. The lights were mostly off, except for a dim glow coming from the living room. I walked in to find what could only be described as an explosion of sheets and blankets. They were draped over the couch, the coffee table, and even some chairs, creating what looked like a nest. In the middle of it all, Rogue was curled up, clutching the pillow I usually slept with. Her ears twitched and her mouth was slightly open, but she didn't stir as I stepped closer. The sight was cute enough that it took me a moment to realize she was wearing something we'd picked out together online, a set of clothes that revealed more of her smooth, non-reflective skin. I smiled, quietly making my way toward her and laying down next to her on the floor. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but with her curled up beside me, it was perfect. Rogue shifted slightly, her grip on the pillow loosening as she felt my warmth. Slowly, she turned over in her sleep and pressed herself against me. I chuckled softly, realizing I hadn't thought this through. Now I was stuck in the nest, and I really needed to use the bathroom. The next evening, Rogue figured out my little trick with the thermostat. She smirked when she saw what I had done, lowering the temperature just enough to make her snuggle closer while we watched movies. With a playful grin, she adjusted the thermostat again, making it a little colder before diving under the blanket with me, leaving only her head exposed. "Humans make such weird aliens," she mused as we watched an old sci-fi movie. On the screen, a small green creature appeared, instructing a young man who had just crash-landed in a swamp. I looked at her, puzzled. "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing," I guess Rogue said, her ears twitching beneath the blanket. "Just a little small, though. I mean, is this really what humans think aliens look like?" I shrugged. "We've never met any real aliens, unless you count yourself in those little gray men conspiracy theories," she laughed, a soft purring sound, as she buried herself deeper into the blanket. "Those things are even more ridiculous. What kind of species would evolve to be that spindly? Where are their muscles? They couldn't survive a day." I nodded. "Well, the idea of little gray men kind of started the whole alien craze. Since then, we've been seeing UFOs everywhere, and thinking lizard people run the government." Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, but I could tell she was amused. "Seriously though, how's this guy just moving stuff with his mind? Some mystical space force?" She raised an eyebrow. "Nope, that's just how we think the universe works in fiction," I said, half joking. "No mystical space force out there." I glanced at her curiously. She snorted. "No, that's ridiculous. Okay, but what about laser swords?" I pressed, grinning. She gave me a skeptical look. "Not that I know of." I leaned in, teasing her further. "Planet-destroying superweapons this time." Rogue hesitated. Her playful expression faltered, and I realized too late that I'd touched on something sensitive. Her eyes darkened, and her ears flattened slightly. My heart sank as I realized I had crossed a line. I reached up, gently rubbing her head the way she liked. She leaned into the touch, her body relaxing against mine again. For a while, we were both quiet, the movie playing in the background as I mulled over my words. "No super weapons like that," she whispered after a long pause, her voice quieter now. "But there are planet destroyers. Ships that fire from orbit, glassing entire cities. People just gone." In an instant, she pulled the blanket up over her head, hiding from the memories. I swallowed, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "You don't have to talk about it," I said softly, cursing myself for bringing it up. Rogue didn't answer, but I could feel her tension beneath the covers. I turned the volume on the TV down, giving her the space she needed. We lay there in silence, me still absent-mindedly rubbing her head, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. A few days later, we had an unexpected knock at the door. It was early morning and we weren't expecting anyone. I glanced through the peephole to see two men in suits standing on the porch, looking rather official. "Who do you think they are?" Rogue asked from behind me, her voice tinged with concern. "FBI, CIA, or something like that," I whispered, keeping my voice low. Rogue's ears twitched nervously. "What should we do?" she asked, already grabbing for the emergency go bag we had stashed in the closet. I admired her quick thinking, but I wasn't sure we were at that level of threat yet. "Grab some clothes, some money just in case. If we need to run, we'll go out the back, but let me see what they want first." The guy pounded on the door again, impatience clear in his knock. 1 second, I called out, trying to sound casual as I delayed. Rogue dashed into the bedroom, grabbing a few essentials. I could hear things clattering to the floor as she hurried to collect her belongings. In under a minute, she was back, a bag slung over her shoulder. I gave her a reassuring nod and opened the door. The two men looked at me for a moment, confusion flashing across their faces. "Are you Samuel Shepard?" one of them asked. I blinked, thrown off. No," the man glanced down at his clipboard, then back at me. "This isn't 25892 Lincoln Drive?" No," I said, suppressing a relieved laugh. "You're one house too far." They nodded politely, then turned to leave. As they walked away, I called after them, "Who are you again?" One of the men glanced over his shoulder. "We're with the IRS." I exhaled a deep breath and closed the door, sagging against it in relief. Rogue appeared beside me, her face a mixture of confusion and amusement. "That was close," she said, her ears twitching. I chuckled, the tension leaving my body. "We almost packed up and ran from the IRS," I said, laughing harder now. Rogue smiled, shaking her head. "Only us." It had been a long day at work, and by the time I got home, it was already dark outside. I had dealt with a chemical spill and hours of misfiled paperwork, so I was completely drained. I expected Rogue to be in her usual spot, waiting for me, but when I stepped into the house, I was greeted by a blast of warmth and the sight of blankets everywhere. The living room had been transformed into a massive nest of sheets, pillows, and blankets, covering almost every surface. Rogue was curled up in the center of it, clutching the pillow I usually slept with. I couldn't help but smile at the sight. Walking over to her, I noticed she was wearing something we had picked out together online, revealing more of her non-reflective, smooth skin. She was still asleep, her ears twitching as her lips parted slightly. Carefully, I lay down next to her, wrapping an arm around her gently. She stirred a little, shifting against me. Within moments, she had abandoned the pillow in favor of snuggling up to me, seeking out my warmth like she always did. I edged slowly around the corner, scanning the darkened house in every direction. Rogue had the upper hand, and I knew it. With her natural camouflage and the fact that she'd disabled nearly all the lights by shutting off the breakers, the darkness was her ally. She'd also locked the thermostat in place, cranking up the heat to levels that suited her alien biology but left me drenched in sweat. Worse still, she'd hinted that the pheromones she was emitting were overwhelming my homemade counteragent. There was no point in trying to increase the dosage, it was already dangerous enough. I could leave the house, but Rogue had anticipated that too. She'd bolted all the doors, and the windows were covered with blackout boards that were securely fastened. And outside? Buried in snow. I hadn't seen her since this morning, when she'd raided the fridge and then disappeared to wreak havoc on the electrical system. 2 weeks ago, she'd warned me she was going into heat again, only this time it would be more intense. Her species only ovulated once a year, which translated to once every 10 months on Earth, and when they did, they became aggressive far more so than the males. They couldn't afford to waste time. The solution to handling this? Well, the old way was to lock the couple in a space together until the heat passed. Apparently, that's what we were doing, and I wasn't entirely sure I'd survive. The first time had been intense, but she'd held back, probably because it was her first heat. This time, I had no such guarantees. The recovery after our first time had taken me a week, physically and mentally reconciling how someone so composed in public could be such a force of nature behind closed doors. I spotted movement in the corner of my vision, and it was my only advantage, however small. Rogue had no night vision, despite her preference for darkness. She relied on sound and scent, her ears twitching to catch noises with a slight delay. Her sense of smell wasn't as keen as a dog's, but it was far better than any human's. She could follow a scent trail with frightening accuracy. Most men would kill to be in my position. I had a girlfriend who would want nothing but sex for the next day, yet here I was, hunting her while she hunted me. I leaned back into the couch, eyes peeled for any sign of movement. A breeze hit my back, and before I could react, Rogue pounced on me, sending both of us crashing to the floor. Pinning my arms down, she leaned in, her smile entirely predatory. "Heck," she said in her native tongue, forgetting to use English in her excitement. "You found me," I managed, trying to keep calm as she leaned closer, her expression sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was going to die, but like the sailors lured by sirens, I realized I didn't care. The next day, Rogue and I sat on a rocky outcropping, looking out over the vast park. She inhaled deeply, taking in the fresh air, her face lighting up. "This planet really is beautiful," she said, her voice filled with genuine wonder. I smiled. "Glad you like it. We were on a weekend camping trip, something I hadn't done since I was a kid." Rogue had been excited about the idea, so we decided to give it a try. It was peaceful out here, an escape from the city. "There aren't many places like this left," I said, gazing at the forest below. She nodded. "It's more than we had on my world. We hardly had any plants left." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push her for details, not wanting to spoil the mood. Spring was just starting, and the forest was coming back to life after the long winter. Normally, I wouldn't just sit and stare at a landscape, but with Rogue sitting beside me, everything felt different. I could have stared at the sunset for hours with her by my side. Her ears twitched slightly, and I knew she was aware I was staring at her, but she said nothing. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm orange glow over the trees, I glanced over at her. "We should head back before it gets too dark," I suggested. "You've got your freaky night vision, and I've got my nose. We'll be fine," she teased, leaning against me. "Besides, it's already too cold to move." I laughed and stood up, pulling her into my arms. "I'm not carrying you back to the campsite like this," she giggled, wrapping her arms around my neck. "And here I thought you were going to be all macho." "I can't use my night vision if I can't see my feet," I pointed out with a grin, setting her down gently. She stretched and yawned, her small frame curling up against me as we started the trek back. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky was nearly pitch black. Rogue grabbed a blanket and plopped down in one of the cheap lawn chairs by the fire pit, demanding I start a fire. I retrieved the matches and kindling, thankful that one of the few things I paid attention to as a scout was how to start a proper campfire. Within moments, the flames were roaring, and the warmth enveloped us. I sat down for barely a second before Rogue abandoned her chair and crawled into my lap, wrapping the blanket around both of us. She eyed the S'mores ingredients and looked at me questioningly. "How do I do this?" she asked. I smirked. "Let's see how you think it's done." "No way. Last time I didn't get help, we had to buy a new microwave," she reminded me, a playful glint in her eyes. I chuckled, remembering the chaos of that incident. "Fair point." I grabbed the crackers and chocolate, extending the metal prongs with 2 marshmallows on the ends, slowly rotating them over the fire. Rogue watched intently as I assembled the S'mores, then took a bite of the gooey treat. She blinked. "That's it. It's an American invention," I said, grinning. "Simple, quick, and full of sugar." She frowned slightly, but leaned forward to take another bite. "More," she mumbled, her mouth full of marshmallow. Sometime during the night, I was jolted awake by a high-pitched keening sound. Adrenaline shot through me as I realized it was coming from Rogue. She was curled up in the sleeping bag with me, but her body was tense, and the cries of distress continued. "Rogue," I whispered, gently shaking her awake. It took a moment, but her cries subsided as she slowly opened her eyes. "You okay?" I asked, my voice soft. Her red, tear-filled eyes glanced at me before she turned her face into my chest. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't push her. Instead, I wrapped my arms around her, letting my hand run through her hair in soothing strokes. Her muted sobs continued, and I could only guess what kind of nightmare had caused her such pain. She hadn't told me much about her planet, but I had pieced together that it wasn't a happy story. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the tent, Rogue stirred. Carefully, she poked her head out of the sleeping bag. "Can you open the tent?" she asked quietly. I nodded, unzipping the flap to let the morning light stream in. We both winced at the brightness, but we didn't move, staring quietly at the sunrise. "I never got to see this on my planet," Rogue said, her voice barely a whisper. I turned to look at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the rising sun. "I was born just after the war. Your planet avoided what happened to mine, just barely. On my world, the nuclear weapons fell. After that, everything we'd fought over seemed meaningless. For the first time in our history, we were united just to survive." She paused, taking a shaky breath. There was so much dust in the atmosphere. It was cold, dark. You couldn't tell day from night. She went quiet again, and I stayed silent, not wanting to interrupt her. "We were rebuilding," she continued after a long pause. "By the time I was a grandmother, I might have seen the sunset on my own planet." She fell silent, her eyes welling with tears. I reached out and pulled her close, her body trembling against mine. Her nails dug into my back as she whispered. Then they came. Her voice was filled with bitterness as she described the day the invaders arrived, aliens with red skin, no hair, and three-fingered hands. They landed outside her city, and when her people went to greet them, they attacked without warning. "We fought them," she said, her ears twitching with anger. "For 5 years, we fought back with guerrilla warfare, but they were too many." She fell silent again, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around her, and I could only hold her, trying to process the horror she had just revealed. Rogue had run off into the woods after our conversation, presumably to use the bathroom, but it had been over an hour since she disappeared. I wasn't sure what she was doing, but there was no point in trying to find her. With her camouflage abilities and the lack of clothes she'd been wearing when she bolted from the tent, she could vanish into the forest with ease. Instead, I focused on cooking breakfast. 2 pounds of bacon, ham, corned beef, and some oatmeal for me, her favorite meal. I figured the smell of it would bring her back sooner or later. "Breakfast," I called, half expecting no response. A few seconds later, Rogue materialized from the woods directly in front of me, her body shimmering into view like she'd stepped out of thin air. I couldn't help but marvel at how far she could push her natural camouflage ability. I handed her some clothes, and she slipped into them wordlessly before sitting down in one of the camp chairs by the fire. Staring at the embers. We both ate in silence, which was unusual for Rogue, given her typically voracious appetite. She picked at her food, lost in thought. "What happened next?" I asked gently, breaking the silence. She looked up, her expression guarded. "You really want to know?" "I do," I replied. "You've told me you've killed people. I get it. You were fighting, like anyone would. Don't think for a second that humans wouldn't fight if aliens tried to conquer us." She gave a weak smile. "You might actually win. I've looked at your history. Humans are far more violent than my people ever were. You've learned the consequences of war. That's why you haven't used nukes on yourselves again." "Well, at least we got something right," I said with a small chuckle, trying to ease the tension. She nodded but remained quiet for a moment longer, pushing her food around with her fork. "We knew we were losing," she continued. "We had stolen some of their ships over the years, enough to learn how to use them. The Resistance made one last attack on an alien compound, and we stole as many ships as we could, fleeing the planet. My ship was damaged in the escape, and everyone with me died. I crashed here. You know the rest." I stayed silent, letting the weight of her words sink in. "So the array you're building in the attic, it's to communicate with the rest of your people?" I asked. Rogue nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm a Vicarion, and I've been trying to use the last frequency we knew wasn't being monitored by the enemy. So far, I've heard nothing." "What happens if you do hear from them?" I asked, dreading the answer. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the fire. "I can't abandon my people." I stared down at my plate, poking the remains of my breakfast. "Is it wrong that I don't want you to hear anything?" Then Rogue looked up at me, her expression softening. "No," she whispered. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. After a while, I asked, "If you do hear from your people, can you promise me something?" She met my gaze. What give the aliens hell? A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I promised. The morning after breakfast, Rogue was quieter than usual, still shaken by the memories she had shared with me. We packed up our camping gear in relative silence, but I could sense the weight of what she was carrying. I didn't push her to talk further. I knew from experience that sometimes people need time to process things in their own way. As we drove back home, I noticed Rogue fidgeting with the ring I'd given her, a small token, nothing fancy, just a symbol of our connection. I reached over and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She glanced at me, her expression soft but still distant. Back at the house, Rogue retreated to the attic, no doubt to check the progress on her communication array. I let her go, understanding that she needed time. I busied myself with cleaning up the mess we had left in the kitchen and living room from before we left for camping. Hours later, Rogue came downstairs, looking tired but determined. Anything I asked, hoping for good news but fearing the worst. She shook her head, her ears twitching slightly. No, nothing yet. I walked over to her and wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her close. Hey, it's going to be okay. You'll find them. Or they'll find you. Rogue rested her head against my chest, letting out a sigh. What if they don't? I stroked her hair, trying to soothe her. Then you've got me. And I'm not going anywhere. She smiled, though it was a weak one, and we stood there for a long time, holding each other as the sun set outside. The world seemed a little quieter, a little more fragile, but in that moment, we had each other, and that was enough. The following week passed in a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Rogue continued her work on the array, and I went back to my usual routine at the lab. We didn't talk much about what was coming, but it hung in the air like an unspoken storm on the horizon. One evening, after we'd both had a long day, we curled up on the couch to watch some Netflix. Rogue snuggled into my side, her body radiating warmth as usual. You know, she murmured, you've gotten better at surviving my heats. I laughed softly. Yeah, well, practice makes perfect, she grinned, her teeth glinting in the dim light of the room. You'll need that practice soon. My stomach tightened at her words, but I didn't let it show. I'm ready, I said confidently, though deep down, I wasn't sure if anyone could ever be truly ready for what she was capable of. Rogue shifted slightly, her eyes scanning the screen as the sci-fi show we were watching played out. You humans have such strange ideas about aliens, she mused. Always with the big, dramatic invasions. Well, we've never met any real aliens except you, I pointed out. She smiled, a soft chuckle escaping her. Lucky for you. As we sat there in the comfortable silence, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we had before her next heat arrived. I knew it would be intense, perhaps more so than the last time, but I also knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. And that, at least, gave me some comfort. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says, we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.